Welcome everybody. It's lovely to have more people. We've heard a lot about communication this morning and the importance of communication and also adapting our style and our stance to the individual in front of us. I've been asked to develop a training specifically in trauma-informed communication skills. And the approach I'm taking today is based on pre-treatment, which was developed by Jay Levy, an American practitioner who's been in the field 30 years plus. And I've adapted his approach, which is an outreach approach, to counselling. And it's talked in much more depth into these two books. And without further ado, I'll just get on really with talking about why communication is so fundamental. Communication, especially early communication with babies, infants, children, is the basis of psychological resilience. It's the basis of psychological processes which allow us to be resilient in the face of challenges, mainly to manage emotional deregulation, which is that is managing our emotional responses, which is one of the first victims of trauma. And it's known as mentalization. When mentalization is weakened due to poor early communication, as we're developing, due to adverse childhood events, or due to social exclusion, when mentalization is weakened, and we all have our moments, we'll all experience weakened mentalization. So when I'm talking about weakened mentalization, I mean extremely weakened mentalization, and over a long period of time. When that's weakened, we're much less able to control our emotional reactions, which means that our encounters with people, especially in a health environment maybe, where we're already anxious about our health, about the stigma we know that we experience a lot of the time, it can lead to what I call high conflict situations, which makes it extremely difficult for us as frontline professionals, workers, to keep calm. Because a high conflict situation is very, very unpleasant and is very likely to cause us to lose our mentalization, and we react on a personal basis rather than a professional one. The approach I'll be talking about today is the CARS approach. It's not meant to replace local safety protocols, but it's a very empathic, compassionate, communications-based approach to talking someone down when they've lost it, basically, due to trauma, due to being re-triggered, due to all sorts of reasons. And our local protocols might involve calling the police. So we might say to the person, look, if you don't calm down, I'll call the police. In a high conflict situation, that might escalate things. That might make things worse because people have nothing more to lose. And what will work for you and me might not work for someone who's already been into prison 20, 30 times anyway. And going to prison is accommodation, is free food, is some warmth. Very different worlds that we inhabit. Okay, so as we know, words can do good or they can do harm. As I was saying, it's one of the foundations of mental resilience. It's a core psychological process, which is why, when we're not listened to, we get upset. Being listened to is very important. That is how we enter social life. That is how we become socialized, by being listened to and by people responding to us. In the case of a baby, by responding to pre-verbal signals. As I was saying, the quality of communication will determine our psychological resilience, our ability to mentalize. Mentalization is the foundation for social skills, emotional intelligence, self-soothing, that's calming ourselves down, empathy, we can relate to how someone else is feeling, and also social emotional maturity. So you can see that it's a fundamental psychological block, a building block that we all need, and that's developed very early on in life, in the first 2 years, mainly at the pre-verbal stage. And that becomes really important when we try to talk someone down. Words will have a limited impact. So mentalization enables us to understand our own role in a conflict. What have I said? What have I done that's upset this person? We're able to change our own behavior in response to the person's response, and we're able to calm ourselves down. We're able to relate to others with empathy and compassion, which allows us to cope with conflict. So again, it's very fundamental. Weakened mentalization can lead to high conflict thinking, which involves blame speak, which is very emotionally intense, unpleasant, personal attack to us. Behavior that's aggressive, defensive. And it's very difficult for us to remain calm and professional in the face of what can be quite an onslaught. Lack of mentalization is due to inadequate early care and poor communication, adverse childhood events, trauma, and social exclusion. The CARS approach, which mainly consists of compassion, an analysis of realistic options in the face of the cycle of high conflict, response to misinformation, because things become misinterpreted, and a setting of limits, which might be important for us to be able to fulfill our role. That can help break the cycle of high conflict thinking and de-escalate tensions. Babies need to experience their caregivers as being available and responsive to their needs. And they express their needs in a pre-verbal way by signalling. And you'll see that in that long list of signals, there will be visual tracking and eye contact, which is all about getting the carer's attention. So having attention is really important. And again, even as adults, being ignored can be very, very upsetting. And when we think of social exclusion, people are invisible. People have no voice. It's the norm to be ignored when someone's socially excluded. So that adds to the damage of early lack of attention and being ignored early on. And this is to stress, really, the importance of non-verbal communication as an adult. That, as you can see, words only account for 7% of the meaning. And that's really important to remember, especially when we're dealing with someone who's in a high conflict situation. because in a high conflict situation, the threat response has been triggered and the brain shuts down to new information. It's only looking for threats. It's only looking for danger. It's not open to new verbal, conceptual, word-based information, which means that our tool of communication in those situations is mainly non-verbal. It's mainly pre-language. We're dealing with an adult baby having a tantrum, basically, and it's all about how do we calm this person down. The parents amongst you will know that your tone of voice changes, your whole physical demeanor changes, and you're calming the child down. And it's the same with an adult, that we're calming that adult down, non-verbally mainly. And as you can see, physical space also has meaning, which can be more or less triggering. So what happens when the baby's signals are not responded to? There's a 3-stage cycle that's been called protest, despair, and detachment. The protest is when there's a threat reaction that gets triggered off. That's when there are stress hormones that are beginning to be released, so the volume of the signals of distress becomes louder and stronger. If there's still no response due to neglect, due to the carer maybe being drunk or whatever, the protest switches into despair, apathy, withdrawal, or in the long term it can lead to a loss of appetite, a loss of sleep, and eventually it culminates in detachment and indifference, but overlaying a state of hypervigilance. So the threat response is primed, which means that the stress hormones are still higher than they would otherwise be if the signals had been responded to. Now, if this cycle happens often enough in that baby's evolution, we end up with a traumatized personality or even personality disorder, which is when the threat response, which we all have, and we all need a threat response, we need to jump out of the way of a bus, but if that response is constantly being triggered, if it's constantly at play, it becomes the norm rather than the exception for us. For us, it's a survival mechanism and it's an exception. When it's constantly being used, it becomes the norm for that person. So the whole system, that person's physiology changes. All the neural pathways are hypersensitized, the stress hormone decreasing chemicals have much less effect. It's a vicious circle. And this is a trauma response. And as you can see, lots of physical changes happen, but the main impact is that the brain becomes unresponsive to new information. So an acute response to trauma is when we jump away from a bus. It's our survival reaction. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is the top line where someone's vulnerable, so they've had the trauma reaction activated from an early age, and they also have very few supports, very few social networks, very few supports. And as you can see, that acute response to trauma, which is our response, it's acute, it's short-lived, for them never reduces. It's almost a flat lining, but at an extremely high level, because they're constantly on the lookout for threat. And I don't know if you've come across Nick Maguire's work, but some time ago he published an estimate of roughly 69% of single homeless people probably suffering from personality disorder. So that will be people at that extreme level of threat response, which means that the people we come across are very likely to already be primed physically to be looking for danger, for threat, which means, of course, that the possibility of high conflict is very high. And of course, personality disorder, or what I like to call a traumatized personality, is a very pervasive difficulty, which very much underlies a lot of other problems: anxiety, depression, suicide, eating disorders. So it's a very complex condition which leads to social exclusion in many cases. Not necessarily, but we can look at a distribution of different populations and we can see that the prison population, 73% of people are deemed to be to be suffering of personality disorder. 70 amongst the homeless, this compared to 4% in the general population. And it rises a little bit with GP attendance, that people are more likely to go to see the GP through a variety of complaints. So of course that inevitably leads really to social exclusion, and we've already heard how social exclusion, homelessness, is traumatizing in itself. So already a weakened mentalization will be further impacted on by social exclusion. We've heard yesterday and we're hearing again today about the effect of nutrition, how that affects people. Of course there's the cold, there's sleep deprivation, fear, anxiety, mistrust. A lot of people my service sees have experienced a history of toxic help, whether the help they sought has made them feel worse. And of course there's the shame and the internalized social stigma, the glances on the street, being invisible, has a daily deep impact. So the cycle of high conflict, much more likely to occur. There's a mistaken assessment of danger. That's because the danger system is already highly primed, hypersensitive. That leads to behavior that's defensive but is expressed aggressively. Which means that our response to that behavior is likely to be a negative one. Because we get upset, we get annoyed, our boundaries are broken, our rules of conduct are broken, our expectations of social conduct are broken. So basically, the first step is when someone feels that someone else is a serious danger. Over minor events, maybe waiting in the waiting room for 10 minutes, that can trigger somebody off. They feel internal distress and there's a target for blame. How am I doing for time? Gosh, yes.
Just 20 minutes.
I've
just hitting 20 minutes.
Right, okay, I'm going to have to really move on, I think. So this leads to behavior that's aggressively defensive. Person goes on the attack. And here it's important to remember that logical restraints don't really work at this stage. And the person's got nothing to gain by reducing the conflict. Or they can't reduce the conflict. That's what we have to remember. It's beyond that person's control. And that gets expressed by very intense speech. It's very personal, comments on our ethics, our professional competence, even our IQ will be made very, very loudly and clearly. It's all our fault. And it's out of context. All the good that our service or we've done in the past, completely forgotten. And this, of course, makes it very hurtful for us, which is why we react. So we're likely to give negative feedback, or even if we give constructive feedback, it'll be misinterpreted. So it's important that we try and train ourselves not to react in a personal way. This person's always been like this, they can't help it, they can't control it, it's not us, it's not up to us to engage in a battle. It's important for us to maintain our own well-being, mental and physical, and of course reflective practice, and to try and initiate a PI culture within our own service so that we can process these things. How do we unlock the cycle of high conflict thinking? Mainly by showing empathy, attention and respect, which is what the baby needs in the early days of its life. Remember the all-important attention. We all need attention. So by showing somebody, I can see you're really upset. How can I help? What's happened? What's gone wrong? Do you know why you're feeling like this? What can I do about it? And again, note my tone of voice, you know, the body language side of it. Not just the words, but the tone, the rhythm, the volume, the pitch. All very, very important. Empathy. Try and listen to that person's experience without judging it. We can judge the behavior, but it's not useful to judge the feelings. Accepting the feelings and then trying to change the behavior. Attention, listen with your whole body. Synchronize with the person's behavior. Eye contact, very important, but not stare nor avoid. Just natural, normal eye contact. Psychological presence. Your feelings, allow your feelings to be registered on your face, on your body even. And listen without interrupting if possible. Respect, of course, suspend judgment, possible to accept feelings if not the behavior. Empathize with a person's struggles, remember they usually can't help it, and remember what the challenges have been on that person's journey. Also, maybe try and visualize that person as a lost, frightened child. They need caring after, they need calming down, they need sympathy, they need reassurance. And that does require some emotional self-discipline from ourselves. Okay, I won't go into that side of it. Responding to misinformation, you can quickly say maybe what's been misinterpreted using your ear. But I'll go on to setting limits, because this is where somebody can become quite agitated behaviorally. And again, what do we do? So one technique is a four-part. You're trying to stop the behavior. I witnessed someone smashing a mirror over their head recently. So it's important to try and stop the behavior. So you stop the behavior with matching body language. You don't become emotionally embroiled. You accept the feelings of anger, of upset, and you suggest an alternative. So for example, stop shouting. I know you're upset. Tell me why. What can I do? How can I make you feel better? It's that kind of attitude. You're kind of responding. But you have to match their level of energy with your level of energy. So that it's equal opposing forces. If you don't match it, the unconscious message is that you can't do anything about that person's behavior. So the person won't respect you unconsciously. So you've got to match the volume and the force, but remain calm and emotionally neutral. And helpful. You want to help. So this is another step. You deliver your message with the matching body language. You allow a silence for the message to sink in. Remember, the brain's not receptive to words at this stage, so silence is important. And then you restate the assertion. When you pace, I find it hard to focus. Please sit down. Oops. Now the person, because they're so, remember that graph, because they're so physiologically stimulated, they might not hear what you say, or they might not understand what you say. So you might have to repeat what you say in the same voice, with the same volume of energy. And listen to their answer, because they're going to respond with something. I'm too annoyed, I just can't help it. I know you're really annoyed, I'm really sorry about that. If you can sit down, I can help sort things out. So you're acknowledging the upset and you're offering something in return. I've had to go through this cycle with a man who was hitting himself with a mirror. I had to go through that cycle 4 times. And in my experience, it seems to take 3 to 4 times to allow the physiology to calm down and for the message to get through. But that takes quite some dedication. You know, you have to stand your ground and you have to keep repeating it 3 or 4 times. Now, most colleagues I come across will do it once or twice, and that's usually not enough. And that's when they turn to the police, and that's when things either escalate or get very unpleasant. So it's important to bear in mind that you might need to do this 3 or 4 times. And again, focus on the solution, paraphrase it, and apologize on behalf of the service if it's needed. Again, you're acknowledging that person's hurt, that person feeling let down, that person feeling let to hang out in the cold. Now the training, I've summarised the half day's training in 20 minutes, half an hour. The training goes into more techniques, and of course the core of it is role playing, so that we can all experience the impact of these techniques on ourselves. So this was to give you a very brief taster of what can be done. I think the training might be on a quarterly basis to help teams review and learn from their experiences. And I'd love to be able to produce an electronic notice board where teams can post their experiences, their challenges, and have a response, so that the team becomes a learning team and the organisation can become a learning organisation. Thank you. Thank you very much.